But Wyndham Lewis knew he couldn't realise that dream alone. To succeed in revolutionising Britain, he needed to create a movement. In July 1914, he published a manifesto. It was a call to arms, a work of art in its own right. And its name was Blast.
Blast, quack English drug for stupidity and sleepiness. Impossibility for Englishmen to be grave and keep his end up psychologically. Impossible for the years 1837 to 1900. An abysmal, inexcusable era. Luxury, sport, the famous English...
It was less a manifesto, more a vitriolic and incoherent rant.
Incapable. Bless the hairdresser. He attacked Mother Nature for a small fee. Bless England, industrial island machine, pyramidal workshop, its apex at Shetland. It stinks of his personality. The aggression, the violence, the megalomania, all of that squeezes through every single page, every single word is Wyndham Lewis taking up assault against Britain. Point one, we hear all sorts of disagreeable things about England, the unmusical, anti-artistic, unphilosophic country. We quite agree. Wyndham Lewis is not pulling his punches here. He's really going for the jugular. He's really attacking England. And I think this, for me, is the most revealing image of them all. It's a wrecking ball. And that's precisely what Blast was. The big, giant, angry, violent wrecking ball that was let loose on Britain and its cultural conventions.
A small group of artists rallied to Wyndham Lewis's cause, and they called themselves the Vorticists. Edward Wadsworth imagined industrial Britain as seen from the air. Cuthbert Hamilton saw steel girders rise up from a building site. And Lawrence Atkinson plotted a cathedral for the machine age. They remain some of the most radical artworks ever made.
The extraordinary thing about Vorticism is that it still looks revolutionary, avant-garde today, whereas most so-called avant-garde today is as stale as old mutton.
And the greatest Vorticist painting of them all was made by the mastermind himself. It is a bold and terrifying vision of the mechanical metropolis of his dreams. This is a very special picture because it's one of Wyndham Lewis's only Vorticist paintings to have survived. Most of them were burnt in fires or destroyed in explosions or ruined in floods, and some just disappeared and were never seen again. You've got this vast, prison-like city of skyscrapers and streets. But the most alarming thing, I think, of all is his treatment of the figures, because they're all dehumanized. They're all turned into little soulless robots, and they're fighting each other. They're waving flags, and they're shouting on to their comrades. You know, this painting now is almost 100 years old. But I just can't believe how truly prophetic it is. It really does prefigure a whole disastrous century of wars and revolutions, of fascism, of ideology, of class struggle. It prefigures a whole century of ever-expanding cities and unsustainable development. And it prefigures a whole century where individuals were isolated, dehumanized, and alienated. And you know something? If you think this painting doesn't have anything to do with you, just look through the window and you can see these little people working away at their Wyndham Lewis failed to turn Britain into his own mechanical dystopia. It became one without him. But a very different dream would come from a most unlikely place.
Years ago, the East End of London wasn't just a different neighbourhood, it was a different world. London's very own Badlands. To get here, you actually had to cross a river of blood that surged down the road from the local slaughterhouses. And when you crossed that grisly threshold, you suddenly emerged into a dangerous and exotic world of criminals and prostitutes and Orthodox Jews and Eastern European asylum seekers. Now, you might think that this kind of place was no kind of place for art. But as it turned out, these slums produced one of the finest painters of the 20th century.
His name was David Bomberg, and he was as tough as they come. His family were Jewish refugees who'd fled brutal persecution in Tsarist Russia. His father was a leather worker and a gambler, prone to violence.
Bomberg's early life was pretty much a daily fight for survival. His brothers were actually street fighters and boxers, and by all accounts, David could throw a mean punch himself. But he had an even more powerful weapon up his sleeve.
Bomberg could draw, and draw well, and he became convinced that art was his only way out of the ghetto.
His world was different from everybody else's. So domestic life went on around him, but his focus was always on, to my experience, always on his art. Everybody else was going into some kind of trade, and he wanted to be a painter, for God's sake. What use is a painter?
Bomberg was determined to break into the exclusive London art world in any way he could. And in 1911, he finally won a place at art school. But not as an artist, as a model.
Bomberg found the job tremendously boring and frustrating too. He wanted to be an artist and not a model. So one day he brought some drawings in with him to the class, and when it was over, he showed them to the teacher. The teacher was staggered because his drawings were better than anything ever done by the students.
Bomberg was promptly offered a scholarship at the Slade, London's most prestigious art school. And here he is, posturing proudly in his class photograph. The Slade was a blessed relief from the hardships of the East End. And with new confidence, Bomberg began to experiment. But the Slade didn't like experiments. And soon, he found himself in trouble.
On one occasion, he actually smashed his professor over the head with a pallet when he dared criticise his work. So you'll not be surprised to hear that he was branded a troublemaker and eventually kicked out.
It seemed that Bomberg had thrown away his one chance to make something of himself.
He wasn't going to be defeated. Already he had that determination, and I think that's probably a very Jewish thing, that actually if you're a minority community, you know, especially then, you get to be tough. You have to be tough.
And Bomberg's fortunes were to change during a visit to the local Jewish baths. It was a spiritual place where the East End Jews cleansed themselves before synagogue. And here, during a moment of quiet contemplation, Bomberg had an epiphany. As Bomberg cleansed himself of a week's worth of filth, he realised he could do exactly the same thing with his art. He could cleanse it of the past. He could cleanse it of all those stultifying techniques he'd been taught at the Slade, and he could cleanse it of all the boring old traditions that had held back so many British artists before. And by doing so, he believed he could make paintings that were purer, cleaner, fresher and bolder than any ever made before. Like Wyndham Lewis, Bomberg broke with centuries of tradition, producing fragmented paintings of psychedelic originality. But his image was one of optimism. Dockers unloading a cargo ship are transformed into a colourful kaleidoscope of energy. And in jiu-jitsu, he celebrates the dynamism of martial arts combat. But for his greatest work, he would turn to his beloved bathhouse. This is Bomberg's first great masterpiece, and he knew it too. In fact, he was so proud of this picture that when he first exhibited it in Chelsea, he actually hung it outside the gallery on the street and then proceeded to decorate the whole thing with flags. And apparently it caused such a stir that it sent traffic jams all the way down the King's Road. Now that doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all, because when he made this in 1914, this was as bold and radical as any painting in the world. Now, it's based on his own memories of the East End baths, and you may not be able to notice it immediately, but it is a picture of bathing. This bright red rectangle, that's the bathing pool. And these blue and white figures around, these are the bathers. These are the East End neighbours of Bomberg. And you can just about make them out doing their thing. So for instance, here's a form of someone diving into the pool. You've got lots of other figures climbing out of the pool over here, swimming around inside. And over here, with the bent legs, you can just make out these bent legs. Here's a figure just climbed out of the pool, drying himself off. So this painting is all about the process of becoming clean. But this isn't just about modern Londoners cleansing themselves of dirt. Bomberg saw this painting as a great manifesto for the modern world. And I think he's telling us that the modern world can cleanse and empower us all. It can even transform the impoverished Jews of the East End into these great muscular heroes of modernity. It can render everyone pure, it can make everyone equal, and it can set everyone free. David Bomberg had found liberty in modern Britain, where Wyndham Lewis had seen only cruelty. But together, their pioneering paintings had completely transformed British art. There was just one problem. No one understood them at all. The British people didn't understand and certainly didn't like this new modern art. But something was about to change all that. Something that would force our artists to abandon modernism and return to tradition. And that something was the First World War.